Bienvenidos a Tres Respuestas, un espacio de opinión, de conversación y de propuestas. Hoy tenemos un invitado muy especial. Se trata de Matt Swift, el CEO de Concordia, una de las organizaciones más relevantes e importantes a nivel mundial que reúne en distintos continentes a lo más selecto de la política, del liderazgo empresarial, de la academia, de la intelectualidad, para buscar soluciones público-privadas que trasciendan en las necesidades de distintas regiones del mundo. Matt ha estado al frente de esta organización desde que nació, la ha visto crecer y la ha convertido no solamente en el lugar donde en paralelo con la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas se adelanta una de las convocatorias más amplias y uno de los lugares de mayor calidad de discusión en la ciudad de Nueva York, sino que también se ha posicionado como un brillante consultor empresarial y tiene además una participación en múltiples juntas y también en muchísimas organizaciones. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you in Colombia, and thank you for being in Tres Respuestas.
Great to be with you, Mr. President. What an honor.
Well, I always begin these conversations asking our guests, who are you? How do you define yourself? How would you tell who is Matthew Swift?
Matthew Swift is first and foremost a passionate entrepreneur who believes deeply in playing the long game and being reputation driven in everything I do. And I am also a passionate U.S. American, very, very interested in all things politics and business and everything in between.
Many people have seen you grow and in all your endeavors. People have seen you create Concordia. Mm-hmm. People know how you have become a very influential advisor and consultant around the world. But I would love to start, what drove you to make the decision of creating Concordia? And I had the privilege of meeting you and also Nick Logothetis when you were in your early 20s, and seeing two early 20 guys saying, you know, we want to build this concept that is going to bring together world leaders and is going to allow them to identify public-private solutions in the Concordia way, which is to co-create. How was that process and what drove you there? And maybe what drove you along your academic life, but also your personal life, the influence of your mother, your father, in order to be that person who decides at very early stage in their life to create an organization that almost 15 years after is now considered one of the top places of brilliance gathering in order to identify solutions for the world?
Well, I think first I'll talk a bit on the founding of Concordia and how it came about. A lot of times people always think, oh, it's got to be, you mapped out this exact vision and it was all connected to every other element of your life and it was this perfectly packaged thing that you then pursued. Mm-hmm. Couldn't be further from the truth. Concordia is the collision of a number of different things that my co-founder and great friend Nick Logothetis and I both were very passionate about. Nick and I met in high school. We went to the same very small all-boys boarding school in the northwest corner of Connecticut. I like to tell people, think Dead Poet Society, but 2006. And that's where we met. And we became very immediate best friends. And we started a business together. So we knew we took that shared entrepreneurial passion and spirit, combined it together, and we created a snack business in high school. And that led to us both knowing we forever wanted to work together. From there, throughout our university years, we had this incredible series of internships at News Corporation. I'll never forget, in high school, we were both 16, 17 years old, and we both loved media, and we loved watching news. We were certainly probably the only guys at our high school who loved watching CNN more than ESPN. Yeah. And we went and applied for an internship at CNN, and they said, come back when you're in college and of age. Down the street was this up-and-coming news channel called Fox News Channel. And so we went and applied for internships there. And they came back and said, we don't really have an internship program, but sure, Matt, you go work in the tape library, which is 4 levels below ground, the vault of 80,000 tapes. And Nick, why don't you go to the 18th floor and log tapes, watch tapes, and type everything said and done on those tapes for the summer. And that you guys can go do that. And that led to this remarkable set of experiences. That first internship and some chance encounters with people like Rupert Murdoch led to this 6-year series of internships where we learned so much about global affairs, media, business, but also what we wanted to go and do. And at the same time, I was very fortunate to study at Georgetown University. And as you know all too well, one of the great things about studying at Georgetown is you have exposure to people that have done some remarkable things in the world, and they come in and they're teaching, and the Madeleine Albright and Jose Maria Aznar and all of these people that you know so well. And so it was that collision of interested in media, interested in world affairs, interested in convening, learning how to bring people together, and having a little bit of the arrogance I think you've got to have as an entrepreneur to look at a space and say, I could do that better. Right. And our last internship in college was working for the Wall Street Journal. And we worked on something called the Wall Street Journal CEO Council. It's an amazing conference of about 80 Fortune 500 CEOs in Washington every year. And that was the conference that Nick and I looked at each other and said, we could do this. We could do better than this. And that's what led us to draft a plan and then start to execute, as you know all too well, with our first summit 15 years ago.
So you were a Hoyas. You studied at Georgetown University. Nick also was in Georgetown, I believe, for some time.
George Washington.
Or George Washington,
yep.
Right. But I always tend to believe that in the course of life, and also in those early years, that you became a policy wonk. Like, you love policy.
Yes.
I also consider myself a policy wonk, and at a very early stage. So I always think about mentors. Who of your professors, of people that were close to you in that early part of your career, became like a reference model or motivated you in order not only to be an entrepreneur, but at the same time to nurture that intellectual curiosity that drives you every day?
Of course. I'll name a couple for you. First was T. Boone Pickens. T. Boone Pickens. T. Boone Pickens became very famous in the early 80s because he was one of the first sort of corporate raiders. In fact, he was on the cover of this iconic Time magazine when Time magazine was talking about the rise of the corporate raider, the activist investor. And Boone Pickens was at the forefront of that. But at the time, and this is where I really connected to him, was here's this very successful businessman who then became a huge philanthropist, donating billions of dollars of wealth to academic institutions, research institutions that focus on health issues. But then he became an activist. He took all of his life experiences and he launched something called the Pickens Plan, which was a $100 million national campaign to explain to the country both what the energy business is and why we needed to be less reliant on foreign oil. And
he was one of the great promoters of fracking at the time.
Great.
In order to bring back energy security to the U.S. and reduce its dependency on foreign oil.
Absolutely. He was ahead of his time, frankly. He was about 10 years almost too early on that, but he was also a huge advocate for wind, a huge advocate for solar. Here's this oil executive advocating for the all-the-above approach in 2007, 2008 at a critical time for debate around the future of the environment and the future of energy. And so I was working at Fox News Channel at the time, and I was assigned to go work at the Republican and Democratic conventions. And my job, it was a great job, was to manage the skybox and make sure the guests who were going on the different Fox News programs were in the box on time and on set on time. And that's when I met T. Boone Pickens. And I reached out to him, and he, very similar to you, has always taken a great interest in younger people and always believed in paying it forward. Your collective experiences, going from being in banking to being a senator to being president of a country, you've always paid it forward, especially with younger people. That's exactly what Boone Pickens did. So he would take so much of his time to spend with me. And I remember he used to joke in the early days of Concordia. He'd always say, why are you doing this nonprofit stuff? Once you get into the for-profit, then I'll invest in you. He would say that a little bit jokingly because he would still come to Concordia every single year. And what I loved about him is at age 88, he would come on stage and it was standing room only and mostly with young people. So he had that effect. Another one who I will say is Madeleine Albright. Amazing professor. She's one of the first individuals that I presented Concordia to and the concept of. And
What an amazing woman.
an amazing woman.
She was a professor of mine.
Mhm.
And I remember how much charisma and thought she had.
Just remarkable. And she had that, she also had that effect. And one of the things that I loved, this, I'll give you a side, I don't think I've ever told anyone this. I almost failed out of college. I almost failed out of Georgetown for one reason. Her class was Monday morning at 9 a.m. And then after her class, she would always say to everyone, I'm going to the Tombs for lunch, across the
Yes.
street, famous restaurant. And if anyone who wants to join can join me for lunch. Well, I had Spanish class immediately after that class. And I missed almost every class that semester because I kept going to have lunch with her instead. And literally I got called into the dean's office and barely got a D in Spanish. So, but I wanted that time to be with someone who had done those incredible things and to learn from them. The third person I'll mention is Donald Rumsfeld.
Yes, what an
Here was this
amazing guy.
Amazing guy. People know him mostly these days from the Iraq War, but they forget this was a man who was a congressman, White House chief of staff, the
He was
youngest.
chief of staff to President
Gerald
Ford, right?
Correct. He was the youngest Secretary of Defense ever. He was the oldest
With Nixon,
Secretary
right?
of Defense. Yes.
With Nixon.
He was envoy to the Middle East. He was ambassador to NATO, and he was the CEO of 3 Fortune 500 companies,
Right.
all in his career. And so he was also somebody who always took an interest in younger people, participated quite extensively in Concordia. And what I loved when he came to Concordia the first time is I think he walked on stage and the majority of the audience came in thinking they weren't going to like him. And he flipped almost the entire room. By the time he was done, they loved him.
Great humor, great charisma.
Yeah.
And he had that obsessive behavior of writing memos all the time.
Called Snowflakes.
Uh-huh.
And he actually, they're all online, available. He had all of them archived, scanned, and put into this massive library that is accessible to anyone online. That was one of the things he did before he died. And so you can go there. And what I love about the Snowflakes, as they were called, is it's a window into history at very specific moments. I even have one of his memos on the wall in my office.
Well, he had this amazing phrase of the unknown unknowns.
Mhm.
And I love that phrase because he said there are things that you know, things that you don't know, but things you don't know,
Correct.
which is a way of always trying to be alert
Yes.
on those things that can either become a black swan or can be a surprise.
Yes.
So I had the privilege of meeting him also early in my career. What an amazing guy.
Amazing guy.
And you know what I loved about his vision of politics? He was a great squash player.
He was.
And he always said, the greatest strategy is to keep the center. And I think in some kind of way, even though he was a very hard Republican, he always tried to look at the center from a strategic point of view. I don't know if you
Yes.
agree with that.
I completely agree with that. And one side anecdote on squash is he's the only person I've ever met who would play singles squash with a hard ball. So it made it actually very dangerous to play squash with him. But no, I think he represented an old school style of American politics that does not really exist today. I remember he did this interview in 2016, and he was asked to comment about Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and what did he think of all of this? And I think the interviewer was expecting him to be horrified by the policy positions presented and how this was changing the Republican Party. And I remember he said, he commented, he said, in the United States, we have this amazing opportunity every 4 years to take these people and watch them run around the track as we decide who we want. And you look at these figures coming out today who've attracted tens of thousands of people at rallies. To take a political message and have that sort of appeal is something to respect, is something to understand. And I think that was such an important message at a time when a lot of the establishment was sort of pulling back in a little bit of fear. So he was one of the greats.
For me, his political persona was very close to figures like Jim Baker.
Yes.
That kind of savviness and also loyalty And at the same time, a great American patriot.
Yes, but his core politics, his policy positions today would not be in line with the current Republican Party.
Uh-huh.
Very, very different. But I think that he would still respect it immensely. He also was always very open to change and evolving. He was of that era in the late 60s and 70s, of course, but by the time he became Secretary of Defense in 2001, again, as his second time, his focus was on modernization of the force. I mean, he had that transformational effect. And we need more people like him. He would always have these amazing press conferences, and he would be very combative with reporters. And so that was sort of what he became famous for. But in fact, if you look at his career, it's one of the most remarkable careers of public service
Yes.
in U.S. history.
Matt, you've mentioned great mentors. You talked about that early stage that drove you to create Concordia, and you said, well, we can do it better. We can have this great summit. And that's where our lives met.
Yes.
I remember in the early 2011, you were planning to have the first Concordia Summit. At that time, I was working with former President Uribe, and he was going to be one of your guests. You also invited President Luis Alberto Moreno from the IDB, and you brought Koshnevsky, who was president of Poland. And, putting together all those pieces and get people to believe and trust in two young guys with literally maybe no formal experience whatsoever was very hard, but you were always so convinced about what you were doing, but you at the same time were so persuasive. What skills do you think drove you to that, and why don't you tell us about how Concordia has evolved from that first summit in the early decade of the 2010s into what Concordia is now, that is so powerful, so influential?
So you asked me earlier about my parents, and I am incredibly lucky and fortunate to have grown up in a household where two things were instilled. One, you can do anything you set your mind to, but two, keep your feet on the ground. And that combination has been so important for every element of my career, because I genuinely believe when I commit to something that I can go and do that. Concordia required at the time, and still does to this day, and this is an essence that I try to protect very dearly at Concordia. We as an institution are still naive enough to ask. And what do I mean by that? We don't take some scientific approach for how to bring people together, how to get the right people in the room. We genuinely believe we can get to whomever we need to get to achieve our objectives with our convening. But at the same time, we've always had this strong self-awareness, this humility to everything that we've done, which I think has been something that is very appealing to a lot of the people that we've brought to our different summits over the years. So I credit that to how I was raised and how I was brought up by two amazing parents. I think with Concordia, when we committed to that first summit, I don't know that we told you this because you linked your reputation and your work to our success. But I remember at the time, we didn't have any money. We didn't have any staff. We'd never held a summit before. We'd never designed a program before. So we had no idea what we were doing. But it takes that belief that you can promise the moon to somebody, and once you commit, that commitment is so strong that I'll do anything to deliver the moon. And I think that's the distinction I think that I want, especially younger people, your younger listeners, to really think about. You're right. It came with a lot of pain, a lot of hard work, a lot of sacrifice, of course. But it was also this fundamental belief that we could do anything. But with that humility that always kept us consistent to our lane and to what we were there to do.
Matt, one person who's close to you, is also very close to me, a person that we both admire, is George Logothetis, who's Nick's brother. And he was one also of the early believers in the whole process. How do you believe George was like that kind of person who said, you know what, you guys have it, and I'm just gonna go with you guys. And now when I talk to George, he feels so proud
Yes.
of what you have achieved. How important was he
He-
at the early stage?
It's not an exaggeration to say Concordia wouldn't exist and be where it is today if it weren't for him. Big picture, it was that he trusted us, that he believed in us, that he gave us. And by the way, at the same time you did. This was all happening at the same time when we met. This was all when we were having this debate. Can we do this? Can we proceed with this? How can we do this? And we had people like George and like you who believed in us. And that is the reason Concordia exists today. But as a funny anecdote, after Nick and I held the first summit in 2011, we met and we both immediately agreed we were never going to do it again. It was so stressful and so exhausting, and we thought we're never doing that again. And I remember Nick called his brother George, and he said, "By the way, that was great, but we're gonna go do something else." And George was like, "Well, can we talk about this first?" And so we went to lunch. He convened us at lunch, and he took us through exactly why we needed to get back to the drawing board and have another summit and keep going. And so there was an element where we almost didn't continue with Concordia after that first summit. And it takes sometimes those people in your life that keep pushing you to get through those moments.
One of the characteristics of Concordia is that Concordia gets to have great leaders, not only involved in the summits, but also the Leadership Council of Concordia is like a dream team of world-class leadership, from corporate to government to science to universities. But it has a lot of those former heads of state, figures who have been in very difficult times, that are seasoned, some that still have some scars from the decisions they had to make that were unpopular but necessary. So you have been exposed to meet maybe the most successful leaders, and you've been able to talk with most of the U.S. presidents since the early beginning of Concordia. Why don't we talk about some of those leaders, and maybe you can list some of those who have inspired you the most, but also what characteristics do you think leadership has to 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 uh, to be at hand in hand, but also what kind of traces of leadership do you want to promote from Concordia? Because that's also something that you're promoting every day. You're trying to motivate new leaders. You're trying to get lessons that can be shared, and you're systematizing some of those leadership assertive moments, and learning also from mistakes.
Well, it's a great question, Mr. President, and I think that what I have seen consistently, Concordia has held dozens of summits over the last 15 years. We've convened almost 4,000 speakers at our summits over the last 15 years. Hard to believe. And I think that there's some consistent traits in those that really stand out. But let me first give a little bit of a cautious assessment. What you describe in terms of that great leadership is becoming harder and harder to find. One of the questions that I love to ask people when I meet them is who's a current world leader today that you would deeply, deeply admire? And it takes everyone a little too long to think of an answer to that question. And I don't necessarily think that's because we lack the talent collectively. I think it's because of the inherent political and media environments we're operating in, where a lot of times the great ones don't even have a chance. They might be those in office doing very, very important work, but it doesn't break through so that people understand the long-term benefit of that policy. You and I, you talked earlier about us being policy wonks. We are both policy wonks. You advanced very important policy when you were president. But it has gotten so much harder in this divisive community and divisive environment we live in globally for people to understand and feel the impact of those things long enough to know why it's critical towards longer term advancement. So I think we're in a challenging environment. And one thing I think about with our convening, first, is we look at convening at Concordia as an art form. A lot of people will come to me and say, well, name all the partnerships that have come out of Concordia Summit. And I respect the question. I do. I really respect the question. And before I would say, well, I actually know about this partnership that came from this and that. But then I decided a few years ago, you know what? I want to own the convening space. My job as CEO of Concordia is to create the best environment in the world for collaboration, partnership, and the creation of solutions to issues and challenges. What the people who come to the summits do with that is up to them. Because I think it's important, we talked about this earlier, that focus. Who are we and who we are not? Concordia, we are all about the art of convening. And so when we bring leaders, what comes with that, Mr. President, is an important self-awareness of knowing that our own personal views of things does not apply. My job is to bring the most relevant content and programming to the broader Concordia ecosystem, regardless of whether I like them or agree with them or not. And so but to more directly answer your question, I think some trends that I've seen in leaders that I like are those that consistently maintain a sense of calm. And you see that when you meet them. You see that when you meet their teams. That sense of strength, that, again, playing the long game, being reputation-driven, those are the leaders that I am attracted to the most. The leaders who oftentimes talk a lot more than listen are oftentimes the leaders I'm most skeptical of. Look at the broader ESG movement. So many important things around ESG. But it became, for a lot of companies, purely talking points, purely communications. And so when I see a CEO come out and say, we've got 17 initiatives, half of them have nothing to do with what their company does, I'm immediately skeptical of that person. But when somebody comes and says, this is what our business does, and this is where we can bring important social impact and value to this space, I'm on board.
Matt, you've also met people who had been in office and have to pass to the new life. And we've had this conversation many times, and I have to be thankful because you have been one of those friends who helped me craft what I wanted to do after the presidency. A great friend of ours is Jared Cohen, who wrote this amazing book called Life After Power about the American post-presidencies. You've met most of the former presidents of the United States of your time in this planet. And how would you judge success in the former presidencies of those American presidents based on impact, based on the things they're doing, but also something that you said in one of our earlier conversations about that happiness?
I think that's a very important question. And you asked specifically about U.S. presidents. I've had the good fortune.
Well, you can also talk about all others if you
other former presidents, right? Of course. So first, I think Concordia, we did something that was so helpful in our creation, which was we saw the incredible power and intellect and experience that a former head of government brought to the table. Not because we wanted to always talk about what life was like when they were president or when they were prime minister, but more because they had this collective, unique set of experiences that very few people in the world have. The former President's Club, the former head of state club, is pretty much the most exclusive club in the world. Those individuals that become a head of government, a head of state. And so when looking, for instance, at U.S. presidents, George W. Bush has always stood out to me because when he was done, he was done. And everything going forward was about the areas where he could have an impact. And some could argue, could he have done more here or could he have done more there? Sure. But everything I've watched him do since being in office has had an impact, has been successful. And I'm also...
He doesn't miss the office at all.
I don't think he does. I think he but I don't think he dismisses it in any way.
Right.
I don't think he says, "Thank God that's not."
No, right.
I think he sits there and he says that was a remarkable experience and chapter of my life that I was fortunate to do, and now I'm in a different chapter.
Exactly.
And I think when I meet a former head of government who spends all their time talking about the good old days when they were president,
Uh-huh.
I think they're going to have a rough time.
Yeah, it's kind of sad. It happens when I have those kinds of conversations with other heads of state. I tend to feel some sadness.
Yes.
But I do agree that the best transition is looking at that stage in life with pride, with great memories, with great lessons, with the satisfaction of giving it all, but also being able to situate yourself in the new eras.
Well, but let's talk about you for a minute. I never hear you when I came in this morning. Our conversation didn't sway too well. Matt, back in 2019, when I was in this cabinet meeting, I've never heard you once ever make references to that. I've heard you reference your presidency in two factors. One, if there was a lesson you learned as president that applies to exactly what is being talked about in that moment, or frankly, to give us a great humorous story of your experiences. And I think that's perfect because you're taking with you those experiences, but your presidency, albeit a very important chapter of your life, is still a chapter of your life. And so I think those are the people who are the happiest. But I think we're in for a very interesting period of what does it mean in certain countries to be a former president. I think what we're watching in the United States right now is a lot of people wishing that some of the former presidents would be more vocal. And I think those former presidents very happy to not be vocal at all.
Right. Well, in Colombia and in
You don't have that problem.
Yeah, there's a lot of vocality. But Matt, since you mentioned about our friendship and the times that we have spent, I have to say that you have supported me on a very crazy idea, which was to take Concordia out of maybe some of the most impactful and prestigious sites around the globe to have the summits. And you trusted me on taking Concordia to the wildness of the Amazon. And we've been there for 3 years. We started in Ecuador, we went to Guyana, now we're heading to Brazil. And I really want to ask you, what do you think Concordia Amazon Summit has meant for you? Because I remember we both were quite scared of being able to take all this group of experts and heads of state to the wildness of the Amazon, and it ended up being something that we enjoyed so much. And the reflection about the protection of biodiversity, talking about market-driven, nature-based solution is something that we both have embraced. But what does the Concordia Amazon Summit means for you?
It's had a transformational effect for me because I remember when we first talked about this concept, and again, I'm one of those that it's not that I'm easily swayed. It's that if I'm with someone that I trust and I know, and they say, let's go do this, let's try this, I'm on board. I'm on board because I'm about people. That's what to me it's all about, the trust and the friendship and all that goes with that. I'm on board. But I remember walking away from that conversation sort of thinking of the irony at the fact that I don't even really like being outside, Mr. President. So this idea of, well, we're going to take Concordia.
You're an outdoorsy person.
I'm not I don't hike. Let me make that, I'm not a hiker. I don't own a pair of blue jeans. So, this was different for me. And up until our first summit was in Ecuador, up until probably the first full day of being there, I was so nervous and had no idea where this was all going to go. We'd never done anything like this before. We'd never done something where we were also, as an institution, responsible for everybody the whole time, right? We do summits in large cities, and what people do with where they go to dinner or what they do after our program, that's up to them. I'm not responsible for that. I felt this strong sense of we're responsible for every single person here the whole time, 24/7. But I think it was that connection. It gave me a completely different view of the environment. I still don't hike, but I love the environment and I respect so much more the critical need to protect it. What I love about your vision that you've had from the start is that there's a component that is about nature, and there's a component about how it's based within what the market is saying. And the reason I connected so much to that is you didn't look at this purely through a philanthropic lens. You looked at this through the lens of saying, how can companies change the way they operate to truly protect nature? It's in their interests. It's in all of our interests. But how do you get them to do that speaking their language? And I think that's been a part of Concordia that I'm very proud of. I like to say to my team always, no echo chambers. I never want to see a panel. If I say immediately to me, a panel discussion on stage where person one says, I think this, and person two says, I agree, and person three says, I agree with that too. It's an immediate failure to me, because that is not reflective of the world we're living in and operating in. So the Amazonas Initiative has completely, frankly, changed my view on the environment.
Matt, since we're running out of time, I want to switch to one of your favorite topics, politics. And you have been a person who has always promoted bipartisan solutions in the US, who has believed that among people that maybe don't think alike, there's always room to build consensus. And Concordia at some point has that in its DNA. It's okay. As you well said, we love debate, but we also like that out of the debate, there can be common positions that can be built. Today in the US, you are very close to many people in the administration, but at the same time, you're very close to people in the Democratic Party. What issues do you think in the next 3 years can have a good level of consensus that will impact in having higher economic growth and maybe reducing unemployment in the US, if there's any?
I think that consensus is very, very much an exception at this point and not a rule, which is very unfortunate. At the same time, I've always looked at politics with a strong belief that you have to understand what motivates people and why people feel the way that they feel. I spend as much time, because if I look at policies that's coming out, if I look at what a senator or a president or a speaker of the House is saying, if I disagree with what they're saying, I've tried to be very careful to then spend a lot of time understanding why other people think that way. And a lot has changed very dramatically in U.S. politics. And as you said, I follow it very closely. I love it. And when I think about U.S. politics today, we're in this era of really pulling ourselves out of the status quo, out of the traditional way of executing policy in politics. And I don't think that's good all the time, but I think it's great now. I think it's what we need. Take foreign policy, for instance. Are we still going to be in the era of consensus by committee and review through multiple diplomatic channels and charters? Maybe. But in some ways, I think this era of a president just picking up the phone and calling another president and talking through is probably more reflective of the time we're in than not. And so when I look at American politics, it is unbelievably divisive. It is not in a healthy state. If you look at the rhetoric on all sides, if you look at the unwillingness to have consensus, we haven't seen consensus really much at all. At the same time, though, a lot is getting done and a lot is changing. And so I'm very bullish on the United States. I'm very optimistic about the United States.
So let me connect that answer with something that comes to my mind. When you look at President Trump, President Biden, President Clinton, President Bush, who are the presidents alive in the United States, they're both they're all maybe the same age with some variations, but it's no larger than maybe 1 or 2 years. They're all
Correct.
in their either
late 70s or early 80s,
early 80s,
including President Clinton.
So that means that in the course of the next 5 years,
Yes.
there's going to be an eagerness for a generational shift
Yes.
in power in the United States.
Yes.
So if you were to make some bets on people from the Republican and Democratic Party, who do you think are going to be in the stage in the next 4 to 5 years, disputing not only the presidency, but becoming those voices that will maybe lead America with that generational shift to the America of the 21st century? Because this is the real moment where with that generational shift is going to be more adapted to the kind of world we live today.
Well, here's what, first of all, here's what has to happen, right? This era of the hammer, this era of the unconventional is going to have a bit of an end at some point soon. We'll see when it ends, right? But in a perfect world, it's going to end when we're ready to elect a new generation of leaders to the table. So you asked for some specific names. Here are the people that I'm watching the closest. On the Republican side, I'm watching J.D. Vance, an incredibly articulate man with a remarkable story. He rose to fame because of a book he wrote called Hillbilly Elegy, which is about his childhood in Ohio. And that story connected very strongly to how so many Americans felt about the time we were living in, and it was a big driver for what drove the rise of Donald Trump. I also think it's really important to look at Marco Rubio. I'm always interested watching the leaders who you don't really always hear that much about, or you don't hear a lot of gossip about. Those are the ones that I think are sort of growing in the right way, rising in the right way. And so I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see what he does going forward. So those are the two Republicans I watch the closest. On the Democratic side, I watch Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, articulate, intelligent, smart, and a very interesting background. I also look at Andy Beshear in Kentucky. Governor Beshear came and spoke at one of our summits, and I remember thinking to myself, that's the closest Democrat to Bill Clinton I've heard in a long time.
Those are big words.
It really...
Clinton is one of the most seasoned and well-prepared politicians I've ever met in my life.
And still to this day, he's one of the greatest political minds of his generation.
Without a doubt.
I think Governor Beshear is that perfect balance between where the Democratic Party is and a value set that connects with Americans. And that combination is very important. You've heard key Democrats after they lost the 2024 election. Actually, no, sorry. It was one of the chairs of the Trump campaign who said this, but I think he was spot on, that Democrats leaned into more of an academic philosophy to everything that they were doing and assumed that the public would just understand it. In fact, a senior Democrat even came out and said, we talk as if we're professors about issues that are affecting everyday Americans. And so there's been that disconnect. I think Beshear bridges that divide quite well.
Matt, my last question. You've enjoyed everything you've done in your life. You bring a lot of passion. You've been successful leading Concordia. You're successful in your business consulting. You're successful in your speaking engagements. But I've always sensed that passion for politics. You're still very young and you're still doing other things in life. But when do you think that moment where Matthew Swift is going to have that step in public office going to happen?
I have no idea, and I'll tell you.
But it'll happen, right?
It could, but I'll tell you why I answer. I have no idea. I think, like anything, as I was continuing my career, growing up, there was a lot about my life that I designed around my plan to get into politics. And it wasn't really until the last few years that I decided, especially looking at the environment we're operating in today, to say, you know what, I'm going to do and be exactly what I want to be. And if a moment strikes, it will strike. And if it doesn't, that's okay. And it's not for lack of passion or want, but it was me really leaning into who I am and what I want. And I think it's an interesting dynamic in this environment today, because I see politics more broadly, being defined today as genuine or not genuine. Straight up.
Right.
I think, 30 years ago, it always had to be the smartest guy in the room. Bill Clinton was the smartest guy in the majority of the rooms he was walking into. And he, as you've spent time with him, he could talk about anything. He could tell you as much about the plant as the football team, as the latest book he just read on the history of Israel. Today, we have devices in our pockets where we can take a picture of anything and it tells us exactly what it is. So I think the future is all about who is genuine and who genuinely that people feel is genuine. And so for me, it's not that I was being disingenuous. It was just that I was playing it very safe. I was being very careful because of my role out of respect to Concordia, but also knowing that we operate in a pretty rough and tumble world in American politics and politics globally. So I say maybe it happens, maybe it won't, but
Well,
you're always going to get the Matt
as
Swift.
your friend, and someone who has followed you closely, I hope for the good of the United States and also for the passion that you have for policy and politics, I hope that day will come. I know it will come at the right moment.
Thank you, Mr.
Matt,
President.
it has been a pleasure to have you in Tres Respuestas.
Thank you, Mr. President. The honor's mine.